Hello, and welcome to From Conjugation to Communication, Shifts Towards Inclusive World Language Teaching and Assessment for All Learners. My name is Beth Wassel, and I currently work at Rowan University, where I teach in the secondary ed program, primarily with aspiring world language teachers, but I also support our ESL and bilingual education teacher prep programs, and I also teach courses in just our general secondary ed program. In my free time, I love to travel and to read, and I'm excited to be here with you today. So where we're headed, we will really briefly talk about some of the big questions, assumptions, and frameworks in terms of inclusive education for world language teachers and students. I'll then share 5 shifts that you can make to your teaching practice to make it more inclusive. And then we'll finish with some next steps and some questions to consider as you move forward. First, I just want to start by recognizing the overwhelming aspects of teaching and being in schools right now. And my intention in this presentation is not to add more things or additional stress, but to make our teaching work for more students, to make teaching even more engaging, more inclusive, and to better support the needs of all students. So let's start with some foundational questions about inclusion in world languages. First, should all students be included in world language study in New Jersey? And second, should all students have access to high quality world language education? Well, hopefully you're thinking about these questions and the answer that comes to mind is yes. However, once we get to the questions that talk about the actuality, the present, the current state of affairs in schools, can we answer yes to these questions as well? Are all students included? And do all students have access to high quality world language education in New Jersey? And I think for many of us, depending on our schooling and district context, this is not the case. The assumption that we'll work with today in this presentation is that all students should have access and inclusion in world language education, regardless of their disability, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, home language, zip code, or any other factor. But it is important to move from what we've observed or perhaps what we've heard anecdotally about students with disabilities in world language and the culture with maybe unwritten rules within schools that maybe we have been stuck in to the research on students with disabilities and world languages. So what does the research say about students who are neurodivergent in world language classrooms? Well, first, there's been no evidence in the literature that individuals with a language-based disability or another type of disability are not capable of developing what Paradis, Crago, and Genesee found to be 16 very important skills in an additional language. And second, the Virginia Department of Education reviewed a series of pieces of research and concluded that success in language learning, depends on pedagogy, the ways in which the teacher fosters a safe and motivating classroom environment, and applying support strategies and activity structures that can respond to a range of learner needs. So this goes to say that it's not as much about the learner as it is about the teaching and the supports that we provide each learner. So next, I'd like to talk about how we can leverage the New Jersey student learning standards to create inclusive learning spaces where all students can thrive. And we're very fortunate in New Jersey that our NJSLS are grounded in what students can do, in their assets, in their strengths, and developing learning, knowledge, and in this case, language and cultural understandings that is inclusive of all learners. So if someone asked me, what is the NJSLS all about? Or perhaps what should world language classrooms look or sound like today? Um, I would probably say this. First, the ultimate goal of world language education instruction is for learners to attain high levels of proficiency. And by proficiency, we mean the ability to use the language, whether it's in speaking, in listening, in writing, um, in those real world ways, which allows them to use the language with ease and confidence in everyday interactions. And so ultimately, learners can learn, use, and practice language that they acquire. Another key piece is intercultural communicative competence. And that is basically the foundation for establishing effective and positive relationships across cultural boundaries, which we know is so important in this day and age. And so what the learning standards currently emphasize is what students can do with language rather than what they know about language. And this is sort of the distinction of knowing a lot about grammar, knowing, for example, what a reflexive verb is rather than knowing how to actually use it in day-to-day conversation. And to that end, grammar serves as a vehicle for communication rather than the meat or the kind of centerpiece of language learning. And this is much different than in years past, where grammar was the explicit focus of much of world language instruction. We also know that now learning in a world language classroom should be can-do and performance-based. And so some of the important changes in the most recent implementation of the standards iteration of the standards is the addition of novice low standards and standards related to climate change, which span across the different content areas in New Jersey. We also see additional spiraling of content and topics. And again, this emphasis on performance really supports students developing in their additional language and moving from that bottom of the novice low up through intermediate low or even beyond as students grow within the language. So to sum those changes up and the gist of the standards, we see that communication and intercultural competence are key, but with supports. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Before we go into some of the world language specific supports, you see here something that probably looks very familiar to many of you, our New Jersey tiered support system. And this is definitely going to come into play in the world language classroom with, this bigger idea that all students should be able to access the curriculum and the content. However, they may need additional supports. Now I'm going to move to 5 shifts that can help us move toward inclusive world language teaching. And you'll see that some of them are changes in what we do, our practices as teachers, but some of them are bigger things in terms of stance or the way that we think about our roles and what we should be doing in the classroom, maybe along philosophical lines. So first, giving up on the goal of perfect grammar and spelling. And I know this is so hard for us as language teachers because many of us really love grammar and spelling and getting things correct. However, that we know that especially in a second language, grammar and spelling comes with time. and is not an appropriate standard for those developing an additional language, especially at the novice and intermediate levels. It is developmentally appropriate and normal to have errors. So really focusing on those errors, whether it's in our written feedback or, grading things incorrectly based on, missing accent marks or incorrect spelling is not appropriate and not supportive of students gaining that proficiency in a language. Also rethinking the words in our vocabulary lists and the amount that we provide to students or expect from them. The research tells us that we need to use a word 30 times before we own it. It really becomes a part of our natural vocabulary. So we, especially in inclusive spaces, want to teach fewer words, but better, or possibly differentiate the list so that you're ensuring that students get a chunk of the words, but maybe additional ones if they've already mastered some of the ones on your core list, or if they want to go further based on something they're passionate about or interested in. You want to ensure that you're teaching vocabulary, not just providing the list, and then it's done in a way that provides it in context and spirals throughout the curriculum. We're not just going to look at this vocabulary on pack your bags and then not see it again until the final, but we're continuing to use these words throughout the year. In using things, right? Actual what we call realia, or visuals or stories to teach vocabulary. These are all things that really help support us to remember and to actually learn those words, unlike our very, very, very long Spanish 3 list here. Another key shift is thinking about your use of class time and emphasizing the interpersonal and presentational in class. When students have that space and that motivation to use the language and to, again, get that support and feedback to grow even further. Whereas at home, they may not be as motivated or have anyone that can provide some of that feedback or just, that interpersonal conversation or interaction. Interpretive, which is usually either reading or listening, can be done as short activities or at home, obviously depending on the language level. You can also think about the text that you're using as jumping off points. Often we, tend to focus on those stories or other little blurbs that are in the textbook for those of you using text. And we can switch those out for things that students naturally gravitate toward. So looking for, video clips or pieces of text that connect to students' daily lives that they're excited about. Also, trading out homework, worksheets, things that really are decontextualized or boring, for things like media consumption or games, which the research shows is really supportive of vocabulary acquisition. Things that students are already doing in their free time, but doing that in the target language can be a way for them to actually add to their vocabularies and to support some of their proficiency growth. And replacing tests with engaging real-world projects where students actually have to use the language. And I always say that you're thinking of it as, the finish line of your marathon or your race is this real-world project. And thinking about then your instruction, the instruction that you provide and the content you provide as training and getting students ready for that real-world summative assessment. And some good example here are you can draw from things that are happening in the community. Maybe it's a public service announcement, or an advertisement to the community. Other sorts of environmental print can be used for written performance assessments, letters to the editor, different things like that. Trying to make it as real life as possible will motivate and engage students. And also, these are things that we can differentiate the rubrics as needed and provide additional supports in ways that we can't on a traditional test for various learners' needs in our classrooms. And so just to end with a few things to try tomorrow, first of all, provide models, for example, assessments, projects, things like that, so that students who need some additional support on what something might look like or sound like have that. Also, practicing wait time. I know this is something that we've talked a lot about over the years, but even with questions, simple questions, using the target language, really counting to 10 to provide that wait time for students. Also, lots of tactile and kinesthetic representations. We know that there is something about touching something or about an object that helps us link or bind the word to the thing, right? Or total physical response or total physical response storytelling. If you're not familiar with those methods, they're really great. And again, building vocabulary, and you can find some more information on the internet about those. And really, when we're providing feedback, whether it's on homework, on a written test, or even just oral feedback, should be based on their comprehensibility, remembering that they are still at developmental levels where they're going to have errors as a natural thing. So providing your feedback on what they did do, things that they did say correctly, and the ways that they were comprehensible, or perhaps some things that they might want to consider to become more comprehensible, more understandable to a speaker or listener, is the really important part, not the grammar or the spelling, until, of course, until those upper levels. Some other what we call counterintuitive strategies. First of all, maximizing the target language use, and that is something that we think may be more confusing to students, but if it's done in a supported, comprehensible way, it's actually a little bit easier for students not to have to go back and forth between languages constantly, again, to get into a space where they're hearing the target language. The teacher's using lots of gestures and slow speech and visuals and language that's routine to make it accessible to students. Asking students what works for them in classes where they've been most successful. I had students recently, one student tell me that he really despised being called, kind of cold called on. So we devised a little method that he would give me a symbol when he felt confident about responding to in a whole group question. Something simple like that can be really, really supportive for students with various needs in your classroom. And again, the theme of today's talk is focusing on what students can do with language in those three important modes that we know are the framing of our New Jersey standards. Thank you so much for joining me today. And if you don't take anything else away from today's presentation, please just remember that all students should have the opportunity to take a world language in New Jersey and to achieve at high levels and hopefully reach that seal of biliteracy, which is the gold standard for students here in New Jersey, that level of proficiency in English and in another language. Please get in touch with any questions. You can get in touch with me via email or on Twitter. And thank you so much for joining me today as part of the Inclusion Institute.